All right, I think I've done it. We made the Yu Yu Hakusho, I'm sorry, the Spirit Gun, I'm sorry. We made the Bone Spirit machine gun build. This is something that in the preseason was, you could like technically do it and it wasn't terrible, but obviously with the addition of the hearts in this season has drastically increased its overall viability and efficiency. This thing is an absolute monster at clearing density for Helltide. It has huge single target damage for being able to kill bosses with Bone Spirit. I'm really excited for how the build has turned out because we tried a lot of different iterations over stream today, about 5 hours of testing, and I think we've really nailed down what's the best way to make this thing happen and to really pop off. So if you've been looking for a super interesting build to play on the Necromancer that isn't just Bone Spear, but still has quick clear speed, good survivability, good tankiness, isn't just another Infinimist or Blood build, let me introduce you to the Spirit Machine Gun. So the primary concept is pretty simple. It all revolves around a single unique item, and while you will notice a second unique item making an appearance here, it's absolutely not necessary, but this is the Blood Artisans Cuirass. If you've watched my stream or you've watched my YouTube videos, I basically told you that this thing was Trash City, and I wasn't wrong. It's an armor that says percentage armor and then no other survivability tools on it at all. But it turns out that if you are just immune to damage, you don't need damage reduction as much. As such, the special effect on Blood Artisans Cuirass means that every single time that we pick up a blood orb, it's going to count up to an amount. So you always want the minimum roll on this thing. And then when 5 of them are spawned, it casts a free Bone Spirit. That's why you saw us able to just dive into packs and they all explode for no ding dang reason. It was because of this armor right here. It also allows you to just rapidly cast these Bone Spirits at max speed because there's no cooldown. It's not based off your skill cooldown. It reads all of the bonuses of the skill except for one key differentiator, and I'm going to go into that one in a little bit more detail, but if you're just here for like the stats, the gear, the aspects, the Paragon, etc., go ahead and check the timestamps below. You can skip around. I will not be offended. But let's talk about the mechanics of the armor, because it's really important to understand the difference between this and the base skill. Bone Spirit is an incredibly complicated skill because it has some of the biggest and most convoluted sets of terms on it that no other skill has. But the most important thing to understand about it is that it has a huge amount of base damage. As you can see with all of our gear on, I have a rank 16 Bone Spirit. That means that this skill is doing 200% weapon damage as a base. So that's already massive in comparison to any other skill. But it's the multiplier aspect that's so important to understand. It says that your damage is increased by 3% per essence, which is the Necromancer's resource, that you have when you cast it. On my character right now, I have 190 essence. That multiplied by 3 is 570. So we're getting a 570% additional multiplier on our damage. So that's a total of a 6.7 multiplier if we manually cast the Bone Spirit. Since the armor has a special secondary caveat, this one instead says that the bonus damage that you deal is based off your current life percent. And since it's based off current life percent, that means that the highest bonus that you can get is 100%, because you can only ever be at 100% of your life. That means that the biggest multiplier you can get from the free cast is only a 2x multiplier. And while that is still huge, right? An armor that says 100% multiplier to a skill damage, that's pretty massive. But it's obviously much diminished from the base skill cast. Now, all hope is not lost, because since it's casting the skill, it still reads any other modifiers that we have. Ossified Essence says that your bone skills deal an additional 1% damage for each point of essence you have above 50 upon cast. And the armor casts it for us. And since it doesn't actually use our essence to be able to cast it, we're always at max essence. That means that right now, Ossified Essence with our total minus 50 is giving us an additional 140% multiplier. So now we have a 2x multiplier and a 2.4x multiplier, but it goes even further than that. The serration aspect says that your critical strike damage on bone skills is increased by 1% for each point of essence you have above 50, and it maxes out at a total bonus of 60. And since again, we don't use any essence, that means that we are always greater than 60 above our minimum of 50 here to hit this bonus, so it's another 1.6 multiplier. So already these free casts of Bone Spirits on a 200 weapon-based skill damage is massive, and that's before you add in any other multipliers that we have like Fueled by Death and Flesh Eater, etc. And on top of that, you could just cast the Bone Spirit yourself. There's nothing actually stopping you. The only nuance is that when you cast your Bone Spirit, it's going to eat all of your essence. So while you're still going to get the 2x multiplier from your maximum life, until you get all of your essence back, you're going to lose out on some serration bonus and you're going to lose out on some ossified essence bonus. Okay, now that we're done with the pure nerd stuff right there, let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the aspects that I have on my gear, some of the stats that are important for it, and also some of the places where I kind of want to move aspects around, because I think that there are further ways to optimize this build, but it's already running fine, like you just saw in this Nightmare Dungeon. Starting on the helmet, we're using Disobedience. I think Disobedience is bare minimum required for the build. On most builds it's required, but you want maximum life, lucky hit chance while you have barrier, total armor, and then you would also want maximum essence on this helmet. You could also use Deathless Visage, which already comes along with crit damage, bone damage, armor, and maximum essence. The aspect doesn't really matter, but it's really hard to fit all the aspects we want onto the build, so I'd rather just get maximum essence roll on a helmet like this. Obviously, Blood Artisans Cuirass is required. For the gloves, you're going to want lucky hit chance, attack speed, critical strike chance, and then critical strike damage with bone. These are my overpowered gloves for my Bloodlance build because I didn't have better gloves to toss onto it. Then we're going to be using the explosive miss aspect somewhere on the build. Now, it doesn't need to be here. Again, we're going to move around some of these aspects for optimization, but it would be fine to keep on the gloves if you needed it here. For the pants, you want maximum life and as many damage reductions and armors as you can possibly get on it. And then we also have the Embalmer aspect. Best part about the Embalmer aspect is going to generate more blood orbs when we manually cast Corpse Explosion, or our Sacrilegious Heart cast Corpse Explosion or Corpse Tendrils. So that's obviously really important for being able to generate more blood orbs against single targets like bosses, while we stack up a bunch of lucky hit proc damage from Blighted Corpse Explosion. And the Embalmer being here is kind of one of the problems. We would ultimately want to put Shielding Storm onto the build. I'm just missing the 3 aspects that I need to rotate everything around, but you do want Shielding Storm as well. Ultimately, I think that the Embalmer could actually move to the Amulet. The Serration aspect, which I already showed on here, could actually move down to the Ring. And I think ultimately you end up not using the lidless wall. This setup is fine with the lidless wall, but we literally just need one more shield aspect slot to be able to move the Embalmer somewhere else so we can put Shielding Storm on. So just to give you an idea, the lidless wall is not required for this build. It just makes it look really damn cool and is a lot better for speed farming. On the boots, you basically want movement speed, all stats or dexterity, and then bone spirit and corpse tendrils. I have dex and all stats. You do want to be able to stack up a decent amount of dexterity. Since they nerfed the serration in the skill tree, it's harder to get up to 100% chance to crit. Obviously, while you have grasping veins and bone storm up, it's a lot easier, but still getting a little bit additional dex on the gear somewhere is definitely helpful. I'm using Wind Striker on the boots. You could also use Ghost Walker so that you have better movement speed inside of Blood Mist. I think it's kind of, you can go either way with it, or if you do end up wanting to use lidless, you can always move at least one of these utility aspects down to the boots. So you can open this up to move Serration over if you want to do that same swap I just talked about. We obviously want a wand here because we want that high lucky hit chance. A lucky hit chance becomes even more important on this build since we need to be generating corpses all of the time, and we basically want to be able to reduce our cooldown as efficiently as possible. We're thinking close to Infinimist here without going so heavily into the darkness setup. I have Grasping Veins on here. Grasping Veins is obviously required for the build. 20% chance to crit and a huge crit multiplier is fantastic for Bone Spirit. And then on the wand itself, we don't actually currently use Vulnerable at all. You could use Vulnerable. It's going to reduce how many free casts you get from Blood Artisans Cuirass if you were to change Corpse Tendrils from Generate Blood Orbs down to Vulnerable, in which case Vulnerable obviously becomes very important for the build, but you basically want critical strike damage with bone skills, intelligence in all stats if you are using Vulnerable, obviously Vulnerable instead of all stats. On the amulet, this one is like not the worst amulet, it's not the best amulet. Movement speed and plus to macabre skills seem like definite auto includes, and then total armor and then probably a damage reduction would end up being best right here. You can also get lucky hit chance when you have barrier active once you put Shielding Storm onto it. Either one of those two stats are really good. For the ring, I currently have Ultimate Shadow here, and then any good stats. So we want maximum essence, definitely. Critical strike damage, again, we have vulnerable damage on it right now, but critical strike damage with bone, and then lucky hit are all really good. And then as a secondary option, maximum life is never bad on any build. And then similarly here, maximum essence, crit. I have damage to close here because we had to reroll one of the stats for the crit damage. And then we're using fast blood. Every time we pick up an orb, it's going to reduce the cooldown of Bone Storm, which helps a lot of the heavy lifting from Abhorrent to Crepify to go a lot farther so you can maintain Bone Storm all of the time. We need that crit chance. Getting the additional Barber procs and the lucky hit procs is really important, especially with Ultimate Shadow here. And then on top of that, just having the increased damage damage reduction in barrier is just ridiculously important. For the hearts, we are currently using the Barber. I do think that the Barber is best here. We're using the Decrepit Heart and Sacrilegious. You could also be using Tempting Fate to get a bigger crit damage multiplier, but I found that not having Sacrilegious on the build just made it that much less efficient, because while we were in Blood Mist, nobody was auto-casting Corpse Tendrils for us. So obviously, once we're out of Season 1, this is going to look a lot different, but I do think that Sacrilegious is the best option here over the additional crit damage, which I just think is kind of overkill. And then again, we're using the Lidless Wall. This is basically just to have more maximum essence and more Bone Storms, because more Bone Storms equals more good. I would much rather prefer to have a legitimate shield here with 3 types of damage reduction and additional maximum life, or you could go with additional lucky hit chance, a lucky hit chance when you have a barrier or cooldown reduction. And then again, since we would open up a utility aspect here, we could move Explosive Mist down onto the shield. We can move Serration down. We can kind of mess around with a couple different options. Another thing, and this is just like off the cuff, I haven't really played around with it, I would really like to be able to get Potent Blood onto the build as well. Potent Blood says whenever you pick up a Blood Orb, you gain 10 essence, and this is just from the Codex of Power. I noticed that sometimes I was a little bit afraid to cast my own Bone Spirit to like clear out a pack or initiate a fight when all of my cooldowns aren't off, and I found that I would lose a lot of damage because I'm relying on Ossified Essence and Serration aspect. But if every single time I picked up a Blood Orb I got back 10 essence, we would be maintaining maximum essence the entire time. So I wouldn't be surprised if I could actually move Serration down to my gloves, swap over to a regular shield, move Explosive Mist there, and then I could actually move any one of my damage aspects and then open up a ring so I could have Potent Blood on it. This would allow you to actually cast the Bone Spirit much more proactively and drastically increase stuff like single target, tanky, elite monsters, and boss kill speed. The skill tree is a little bit eclectic here. There are a lot of different options that you kind of have to keep at your forefront for how we're piloting the build, but Hemorrhage is a great option, one to just be able to generate essence against single targets as well as packs whenever you pick up a Blood Orb, and on top of that having a lot of additional increased attack speed. It also generates Blood Orbs for us so that while we're fighting against a boss, if we don't happen to manage to generate enough corpses, we can be generating our own Blood Orbs proactively and then use those to auto-proc our armor. 3 points into Unliving Energy for the maximum essence, 3 points into Hued Flesh for the corpses, only 1 point into Blood Mist, as well as picking up the Blood Mist generates corpses. We do have 1 point into Corpse Explosion with Blighted Corpse Explosion, just as a huge lucky hit engine. Only 1 point into Grim Harvest. You could also kind of move around 2 points here, but I think ultimately with Hemorrhage, and especially if you put Potent Blood on the build, you absolutely shouldn't put more than just 1 here. And then the 3 points into Fuel Death, obviously for the huge damage bonus whenever we consume a corpse. We are using the heart to auto-cast our Decrepify, which procs our Abhorrent Decrepify, as well as our stun chance, and then also applies amplified damage for us. We had an extra point lying around, so I tossed it into Death's Embrace since we're close to targets a lot of the time. I just realized that I had 5 points in Corpse Tendrils, so why don't we go ahead and put those back into Blood Mist, since that cooldown is infinitely more important than Corpse Tendrils is. Corpse Tendrils already has a pretty low cooldown, so just 1 point here, and then again we're using the Blood Orb option. If you wanted to make it so that you just dealt more damage against targets, you can activate more things, you could obviously use Vulnerable, but you're basically going to cut down your ability to generate Blood Orbs proactively by about half. Maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. You're going to have to fit it to your own playstyle and your own gear. Maxing out Bone Spirit, you'll see that we have rank 16 Bone Spirit here, and then I am using Ghastly Bone Spirit. We don't always have Corpse Tendrils up, we don't always have Bone Storm up, so this additional crit chance helps to make sure that none of our Bone Spirits basically whiff, but if you were at 100% chance to crit somehow all of the time, you could obviously drop it down to Dreadful Bone Spirit so that you can more actively utilize this skill proactively, and then actually be able to regenerate that essence super quick. Only 3 points into Serration here because I'm not using Vulnerable and I'm not relying on Compound Fracture. I don't think you even necessarily need to pick up any of these skills. Yes, Rapid Ossification would help to reduce the cooldown of Bone Spirit by a little bit, and being able to pick up Avulsion again if you're using Vulnerable status from up here would be a huge damage multiplier. 1 point into Reaper's Pursuit to get a little bit of additional move speed whenever our Blighted Corpse Explosion ticks, and then Crippling Darkness just to add on a little bit of crowd control, a little bit of survivability, and an additional stagger option against bosses. 3 points into Inspiring Leader because being able to get into our animations as quickly as possible is very valuable. 3 points into Standalone, 3 points into Memento Mori, and then obviously Bone Storm with all of its modifiers and Ossified Essence. The Paragon tree is kind of hyper specialized to exactly how I'm building right now. It's slightly inefficient because I actually built this out of a a separate build. So I was already in the Bloodbath, and I do want to pick up this glyph socket here, but I wouldn't want to path out of it. I'd like to be able to pick this up later on, so there's going to be some optimization. But Blood Drinker to be able to generate Fortify, as well as having a good magic bonus. That's why we're picking up all this additional armor in Dex and damage over here to get the biggest bonus out of that. In Bloodbath, again, you want to put this like later on, since you don't care about any of the rare nodes here. We are putting Essence for the additional crit damage, and then when monsters aren't healthy, especially bosses, we gain that additional crit multiplier. I'm currently running Amplify in the Bonegraft board. Obviously, Bonegraft is a really good Dex board, so there's a world where you actually want to move Territorial up there. You'd get an additional 5 points. What I do like about it, though, is that it has a magic bonus node affix right here, so we're able to increase the bone skill damage that we get out of these nodes. I don't think that's terrible. Obviously, the additional 1.1 multiplier is fantastic, but you could very easily move any one of the other Dex ones here and then move Amplify somewhere else. I am picking up the Calcified, Reinvigorate, as well as Entomb, and then building down to Bonegraft. Here into Flesh Eater. Flesh Eater is a huge overall multiplier for us, obviously, and this is where I currently have Territorial as a 44 investment for Dex. Big damage reduction from close, which is good for us, and then additional additive damage to close. There's also a world where you can use Control. Control is obviously a great glyph since it's going to give us a 1.2 multiplier whenever we stun monsters, as well as additional additive damage if we manage to stagger a boss. But Territorial says we always have an additive damage bonus regardless of whether or not it's staggered, so that's why I'm using this one here. There's also a world where I'd like to go pick up Color just for the additional attack speed here, but it's not super important on this version of the build. And then we're building into Scent of Death. Scent of Death picking up this node here just for additional crit damage and additional damage to healthy enemies to increase our one-shot potential. And then I want to build over to the glyph as well. Sadly, none of the things around the glyph are incredibly important to us. Obviously, this armor is really nice. I would probably end up putting the Imbiber glyph here and then maxing this out since Scent of Death is such a good willpower board. But that's this absolutely ridiculous thing that reminded me of one of my favorite animes of all time, Yu Yu Hakusho, the Spirit Detective with the Spirit Shotgun. I was just like, this is exactly what I want this build to look like. I'm really excited that in season 1, it gets to be so much more fluid and viable and just that much more efficient. And I really hope that if you haven't tried out this build or if you've never looked at this build, you give it a shot, because quite frankly, it's some of the most fun that I've had playing this game since the season has started. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm trying to bring you more content. I'm doing my best. I actually went back and looked, and I think I released 26 videos in the past month, so hopefully you enjoyed those. Sorry for the spam, but I'm just trying to make sure that I'm putting out like quality content all the time, and if you appreciate that or if you enjoy it, go ahead and click that button and let YouTube algorithm know that, hey, there's something cool to look over here. Thank you again very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.